Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The silent breakfast. Have you ever sat across from someone you love more than anything, only to realize that the silence between you feels louder than every word you have ever spoken? If you have ever wondered whether one ordinary morning could quietly change an entire family forever, stay with me until the end of the story. Today, I want to share a true-to-life journey about love, parenting, family, American life, and learning English through simple conversations. This story begins with a breakfast that looked completely normal, but became the moment I realized my son had stopped talking to me. And I had no idea why. It was a cold autumn morning in the United States. The trees outside our window had already turned bright shades of orange and red, and a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across our quiet neighborhood. I woke up early, just as I always did, prepared scrambled eggs, toasted bread, and poured fresh orange juice into 3 glasses. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen while soft morning sunlight slowly entered through the curtains. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked familiar. But something was different. My teenage son walked downstairs wearing his backpack, looked briefly toward the table, sat down without saying a single word, and quietly started eating his breakfast. Normally he would say, "Good morning, Mom," or ask if we still had peanut butter. Sometimes he even joked about being too tired to go to school. That morning there was nothing. Not one smile. Not one question. Not even eye contact. At first I thought he was simply sleepy. Teenagers often need more sleep, and many parents in America joke that mornings are not the best time for conversation. I smiled anyway and asked gently, "Did you sleep well?" He nodded once without looking up. A few minutes later I tried again. "Do you have a math test today?" Another short nod. No words. My husband noticed the silence too, but he quietly changed the subject and talked about the weather instead. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before my son stood up, picked up his backpack, whispered, "Bye, Dad," and walked out the front door. He never looked at me. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house far longer than it should have. I remained standing beside the kitchen counter, wondering what had just happened. Had I forgotten something important? Had I embarrassed him yesterday? Was he angry? Was he simply growing up? Parenting experts often explain that teenagers naturally seek independence as their brains continue developing, especially the areas responsible for emotions and decision-making. During adolescence, communication with parents sometimes decreases, not always because love disappears, but because young people are learning who they are. I knew those facts. I had read the articles. Yet understanding psychology felt completely different from living it inside my own home. Throughout the day, I could not stop thinking about that silent breakfast. While driving to work, I replayed every conversation we had shared during the previous week. I remembered reminding him to finish his homework. I remembered asking him to spend less time on his phone. I remember telling him to be careful when riding his bicycle. None of those conversations seemed unusual. They sounded like ordinary parenting. Still, something inside me whispered that I had missed an important signal. That evening I prepared his favorite homemade chicken soup, hoping dinner would feel warmer than breakfast. When he arrived home, he thanked his father for helping him with a science project, but once again said almost nothing to me. He answered my questions with only 1 or 2 words before returning to his room. The silence was no longer accidental. It had become a wall. As I stood alone washing the dinner dishes, I suddenly noticed something that made my heart sink. A family photo hung on the refrigerator door, taken only 6 months earlier during a spring picnic in a nearby American park. In the picture, my son was laughing with his arm around my shoulder. We looked genuinely happy. I touched the edge of the photograph and quietly asked myself the question every parent fears. What happened between then and now? Sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, I opened my old English notebook, the one I had used years earlier when I first arrived in America. Across one page, I had written a simple sentence that my teacher repeated again and again. Small conversations build strong relationships. I stared at those words for several minutes. Back then, I believed they only applied to learning English. Now I wondered if they also held the answer to saving my relationship with my son. I had been so busy reminding him what to do that perhaps I had forgotten to ask how he truly felt. I had focused on schedules, homework, and responsibilities while overlooking the quiet emotions hiding behind his smile. Little did I know, the real reason for his silence was already waiting inside our home, hidden in a place I walked past every single day without ever noticing it. Looking for the reason. The strange thing about family problems is that they rarely arrive all at once. They usually grow quietly, almost invisibly, like tiny cracks in a window that no one notices until sunlight shines through them. The morning after my son ignored me at breakfast, I promised myself I would pay closer attention instead of jumping to conclusions. Maybe he was simply having a difficult week. Maybe school was more stressful than I realized. Maybe I had imagined everything. But deep inside, a mother's heart often notices changes long before there is proof. That afternoon, while driving home through our quiet suburban neighborhood in the United States, I remembered something unusual. Only a few months earlier, my son had talked constantly during car rides. He would tell me funny stories about his classmates, ask questions about American history, or laugh while correcting my English pronunciation. Sometimes he even challenged me to learn one new English word every day. Those short conversations never seemed important at the time. Now I would have given anything to hear one of them again. When I arrived home, I walked past the hallway where family photos covered one side of the wall. Every picture captured a different season of our lives in America. Our first Thanksgiving dinner, a camping trip to Yellowstone National Park, my son's first baseball game, Christmas mornings filled with laughter. Looking carefully, I noticed something surprising. As the years passed, my son had grown taller with every photograph, but another change was quietly happening too. He smiled less. It wasn't dramatic. It happened so gradually that I had never noticed before. Developmental psychologists often explain that teenagers experience enormous emotional and neurological changes. During adolescence, the brain regions responsible for emotional regulation and identity are still developing, making young people especially sensitive to criticism and deeply eager to feel understood. Reading those facts years ago felt interesting. Living them inside my own family felt heartbreaking. That evening, instead of asking my usual questions about homework or grades, I simply knocked gently on my son's bedroom door. "Can I come in?" I asked. "Sure," he answered without looking away from his computer screen. I sat quietly in the chair beside his desk. The room looked different from how I remembered. Childhood toys had disappeared. Sports trophies gathered dust on the shelf. School books, headphones, and notebooks had replaced stuffed animals and comic books. Growing up doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary bedrooms. I smiled softly and tried starting a simple conversation. "How was school today?" "Fine." "Anything interesting happen?" "Not really." Another silence filled the room. This time I didn't rush to break it. Communication experts often say that silence isn't always the enemy. Sometimes people need space before they feel safe enough to speak. So instead of asking another question, I noticed a small sketchbook lying partially open beside his backpack. Before I could stop myself, my eyes caught a simple pencil drawing. It showed a young boy standing alone while two adults talked behind him. Above the drawing were 4 handwritten words, "Nobody really hears me." My heart dropped instantly. I quickly looked away before he realized I had seen it. He quietly closed the sketchbook without saying anything. We sat there for another minute before I finally stood up. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, I said gently. "Okay," he replied. As I walked out of the room, those 4 words echoed through my mind. Nobody really hears me. During dinner that evening, I watched more carefully than ever before. My husband talked enthusiastically about work. I discussed grocery shopping and weekend plans. My son answered politely whenever someone asked him a direct question, but he never started a conversation himself. Suddenly I noticed something uncomfortable. Every topic at the table revolved around schedules, responsibilities, grades, chores, or future plans. Nobody asked how anyone actually felt. We were communicating, but perhaps we were no longer connecting. Researchers studying family communication have found that children who regularly feel listened to without immediate judgment develop stronger emotional security and are more likely to share personal concerns with their parents. I wondered when I had accidentally stopped listening and started managing instead. Later that night, while organizing the laundry, I found one of my son's hoodies draped across the living room chair. As I folded it, a folded piece of paper slipped from the pocket and landed softly on the floor. I had no intention of reading something private, but one sentence was already visible before I could pick it up. It read, "I wish Mom would ask what's wrong instead of trying to fix everything." I froze. My hands trembled as I carefully folded the paper exactly the way I had found it and placed it back inside the pocket. Tears filled my eyes because I suddenly realized something painfully simple. My son wasn't asking for perfect advice. He wasn't asking for expensive gifts or impossible solutions. He was asking to be heard. Yet I still didn't know what had hurt him enough to stop talking to me. As I quietly returned the hoodie to his room, I noticed another object resting beneath his bed, a small blue notebook I had never seen before. Across the cover, written in black marker, were 3 words that instantly filled me with both fear and curiosity. Things I can't say. My own mistakes. Some discoveries don't happen because you find a hidden secret. They happen because you finally become brave enough to look honestly at yourself. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood quietly outside my son's bedroom door. The small blue notebook was still resting beneath his bed where I had noticed it earlier. Across the cover were the words, "Things I can't say." Every part of me wanted to open it. Every part of me wanted immediate answers. But another voice inside reminded me that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. If I opened that notebook without permission, I might satisfy my curiosity while losing something much more valuable. So I slowly stepped away. For the first time since my son stopped talking to me, I realized the mystery was not hidden inside his notebook. It might be hidden inside my own habits. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and poured myself a cup of coffee before the rest of the family came downstairs. Instead of checking emails or scrolling through my phone, I opened my old English journal. Years ago, when I first arrived in the United States, I had written almost every day because writing simple English sentences helped me practice both the language and my confidence. As I turned the faded pages, one sentence immediately caught my attention. Listen first. Speak second. I smiled sadly because I remembered how seriously I had once followed that advice. Back then, every English conversation required careful listening. I couldn't interrupt because I was still learning. Ironically, as my English improved, I began talking more and listening less. That realization stayed with me throughout the day. While driving to work, I replayed dozens of conversations with my son from the past year. Little by little, a painful pattern appeared. He would begin telling me about something that happened at school, and before he finished, I often jumped in with advice. If he complained about a difficult teacher, I immediately suggested studying harder. If he mentioned feeling tired, I reminded him to sleep earlier. If he worried about making friends, I encouraged him to be more confident. My intentions were loving, but my timing was terrible. I had become a professional problem solver instead of a patient listener. Family therapists often explain that children, especially teenagers, do not always begin conversations because they want solutions. Many simply want to feel understood before hearing advice. Feeling emotionally validated helps reduce stress and strengthens trust, making future communication much easier. Suddenly those ideas stopped sounding like interesting psychology articles. They became mirrors reflecting my own parenting. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. During my lunch break, I found an old video on my phone from nearly 5 years earlier. My son was only 10 years old. We were walking through a farmer's market in our small American town while practicing easy English together. He pointed excitedly at fresh apples and proudly said, "Mom, these are the biggest apples ever." I laughed in the video and answered with playful exaggeration, "Maybe they're bigger than basketballs." He laughed so hard that he nearly dropped the shopping bag. Watching the recording, I noticed something beautiful. Neither of us cared about perfect grammar. We were simply enjoying each other's company. Somewhere along the way, conversations had quietly transformed into reminders, instructions, schedules, and expectations. That evening I decided to try something different. When my son came home from school, I resisted the familiar questions. I didn't ask about homework. I didn't ask about grades. Instead, while we were both putting groceries away in the kitchen, I simply said, "I saw some beautiful autumn leaves on my drive today." They reminded me of our trip to Vermont a few years ago. He looked at me for just a second. "Yeah," he said softly. "That was a nice trip." It wasn't much, but it was the longest sentence he had spoken to me all week. I smiled without pushing the conversation further. Communication researchers often describe this as reducing conversational pressure. When people don't feel forced to respond, they are often more willing to continue naturally. I finally understood that rebuilding trust might not require one dramatic conversation. It might require hundreds of small, safe moments. Before going to bed, I walked past the family bookshelf and noticed one of my son's favorite novels sitting slightly out of place. A folded bookmark was sticking out from between the pages. Without thinking, I picked up the book to return it neatly to the shelf. The bookmark slipped onto the floor. On one side was a simple mountain drawing. On the other side, written carefully in blue ink, were words that stopped me completely. Sometimes the loudest people never hear the quietest hearts. I stood there in absolute silence because, for the first time, I wasn't asking what was wrong with my son anymore. I was asking what needed to change inside me. And I had no idea that the very next day, a quiet conversation with someone at his school would reveal a truth I had never even considered, one that would completely change the way I understood my own child. A teacher's gentle advice. Sometimes the conversation that changes your life begins with words you never expected to hear. The following afternoon, my phone rang while I was finishing work. When I saw the name of my son's school on the screen, my heart immediately started racing. Every parent knows that feeling. In just a few seconds, your mind imagines 100 different possibilities. Had he been hurt? Was he in trouble? Had something happened during class? I answered quickly, trying to keep my voice calm. Instead of bad news, I heard a warm, gentle voice. "Hello, this is Mrs. Parker, your son's English teacher. Nothing is wrong. I was simply wondering if you might have a few minutes to stop by after school today." I agreed immediately, although curiosity followed me the entire drive to campus. The school looked peaceful beneath the bright autumn sky. Students laughed while walking toward the parking lot. Colorful leaves covered the sidewalks. And yellow school buses slowly disappeared around the corner. Everything seemed completely ordinary. Yet I couldn't stop wondering why his teacher wanted to meet me. Mrs. Parker welcomed me with a kind smile and invited me into her classroom. Books filled every shelf, student artwork decorated the walls, and handwritten vocabulary cards hung above the whiteboard. It felt warm, comfortable, and safe. She offered me a seat before speaking. "First," she said softly, "I want you to know that your son is a wonderful student. He's respectful, thoughtful, and always willing to help others." Relief washed over me. At least this wasn't about poor grades or bad behavior. Then her expression became more thoughtful. "But lately," she continued, "I've noticed something different." My heart quietly tightened again. He participates less during discussions. He finishes his work, but he seems emotionally distant. I nodded slowly. "He's been very quiet at home too." Mrs. Parker remained silent for a few seconds before asking one unexpected question. "When was the last time you and your son had a conversation that wasn't about school, responsibilities, or solving a problem?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I honestly couldn't remember. She smiled kindly, not because she wanted to embarrass me, but because she seemed to understand exactly what I was struggling with. "Many parents believe communication means talking," she said. "Sometimes communication simply means making someone feel safe enough to speak." Those words settled deep inside me. Educational psychologists often explain that teenagers communicate most openly when they feel emotionally accepted rather than immediately evaluated. When young people expect advice, criticism, or correction before they finish speaking, they naturally begin protecting themselves through silence. Suddenly, my son's behavior didn't seem mysterious anymore. Perhaps silence wasn't punishment. Perhaps it was protection. Mrs. Parker walked toward her desk and picked up a folded worksheet. "We recently completed an assignment called The Person Who Understands Me," she explained. Students could choose anyone, a friend, a grandparent, a coach, even a pet. She hesitated for a moment before adding gently, "Your son wrote something beautiful, and with his permission, I'd like to share one sentence." My hands felt strangely cold as she unfolded the paper. She didn't hand it to me. Instead, she quietly read one line aloud. "I know my mom loves me. I just miss talking to her without feeling like I'm taking another test." I closed my eyes for a second because those words hurt more than I expected. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They were honest. Looking back, I realized how often I had unintentionally turned ordinary conversations into evaluations. "Did you finish your homework? Did you study enough? Why didn't you answer sooner? Did you remember this?" Every question came from love, but perhaps love had begun sounding like pressure. Mrs. Parker gently leaned forward. "May I give you one suggestion?" I nodded immediately. "Tonight," she said, "don't ask him any questions." I looked surprised. She smiled. "Tell him one story instead. Something about yourself. Something funny. Something imperfect. Let him see that conversations aren't always interviews." Research on family communication consistently shows that parents who occasionally share their own experiences, mistakes, and emotions create stronger emotional trust with their children. Vulnerability often invites vulnerability. As I thanked Mrs. Parker and walked back toward my car, I couldn't stop thinking about her advice. Maybe I had spent years trying to teach my son how to become a successful adult while forgetting to show him that adults are still learning too. That evening, instead of preparing another speech about responsibility, I decided I would simply tell him a story from my own life in America, a story about my first embarrassing English mistake that still made me laugh. I wasn't trying to teach him anything. I simply wanted him to know the real me again. As I unlocked the front door, I noticed a pair of unfamiliar sneakers sitting beside the entrance. My son wasn't alone. A friend had come over after school. As I quietly walked past the hallway, I accidentally heard my son's voice through the slightly open living room door. It was the first time I had heard him speak freely in days. Then one sentence stopped me in my tracks. I wish my mom knew why I stopped talking. But I don't know how to tell her. I froze, realizing the answer I had been searching for was finally within reach, and it was far more heartbreaking than I had ever imagined. The letter I never expected. Some truths don't arrive through arguments. They arrive quietly, almost by accident, when life decides that your heart is finally ready to hear them. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still resting on the doorknob after hearing my son's voice through the living room door. I wish my mom knew why I stopped talking, but I don't know how to tell her. His words echoed inside my mind long after the conversation with his friend had ended. I didn't step into the room. I didn't interrupt. For the first time in weeks, I realized this story wasn't about convincing my son to speak. It was about creating a place where he would feel safe enough to speak when he was ready. That evening, I quietly prepared dinner while pretending everything was normal. My husband noticed I was unusually thoughtful, but didn't ask why. Sometimes the people who love us understand that silence also deserves respect. During dinner, I followed Mrs. Parker's advice. I didn't ask about homework. I didn't ask about grades. Instead, I smiled and said, "Can I tell you something embarrassing that happened when I first moved to America?" My son looked up for the first time in days. I laughed softly before continuing. I walked into a grocery store and wanted to buy baking powder. Instead, I confidently asked an employee where I could find washing powder because I mixed up the words. She looked completely confused, and I didn't understand why everyone around me was smiling. My husband laughed immediately. A few seconds later, something beautiful happened. My son smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. "Mom," he said quietly, "that would have been really awkward." I laughed too. It was. That tiny exchange lasted less than a minute, but it felt like the first ray of sunlight after a very long winter. Researchers studying family relationships often explain that shared laughter lowers emotional tension and makes difficult conversations feel less threatening. Looking at my son smiling again, I believed every word of that research. Later that night, while folding clean towels upstairs, I heard a gentle knock on my bedroom door. My daughter stepped inside holding a white envelope. "Mom," she whispered, "I found this while helping my brother clean his desk. I don't think he wanted anyone to see it." I looked at the envelope. Across the front, written carefully in my son's handwriting, were 3 simple words. "For Mom." My heart immediately began beating faster. "Did you read it?" I asked gently. She quickly shook her head. "No. I thought it belonged to you." After she left, I sat quietly on the edge of my bed staring at the unopened envelope. Part of me wondered whether I should wait until my son gave it to me himself. Another part noticed something unusual. The envelope wasn't sealed. A corner of the folded paper inside was already visible, almost as though he had wanted to deliver it but lost the courage at the last moment. I carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting started confidently before gradually becoming less steady. "Dear Mom," it began. "I'm not angry because you don't love me. I know you love me every day. The problem is that sometimes I feel like you're always trying to improve me instead of simply being with me. When I tell you something difficult, I don't always need an answer. Sometimes I just want you to sit beside me for a while." I stopped reading because tears blurred the page. My son continued. "When I was little, we laughed while practicing English together. We made mistakes together. We told funny stories. Now every conversation feels like another reminder about homework, responsibilities, or the future. I miss my mom more than you probably realize, even though you're still here every day. Every sentence felt gentle, never accusing, yet every word reached places inside my heart that I had ignored for far too long. Family psychologists often describe emotional presence as one of the strongest predictors of trust between parents and children. Being physically present is important, but feeling emotionally available matters even more. Sitting there with my son's letter in my hands, I understood the difference completely. I had given him meals, transportation, school supplies, encouragement, and advice. Yet somewhere along the journey, I had unintentionally given him less of the one thing he needed most, my full attention without expectations. At the very bottom of the page, one final sentence was written smaller than the others, almost as if he had hesitated before writing it. I hope one day we can talk like we used to. I quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. I wasn't sad anymore. For the first time since this journey began, I finally understood the real problem. And because I understood it, maybe it could be healed. The next morning, before anyone else woke up, I made one simple decision. I would stop trying to repair our relationship with perfect words. Instead, I would begin with one quiet walk, one honest conversation, and one promise to listen more than I spoke. What I didn't know was that my son had already made a decision of his own. And when we unexpectedly met later that afternoon in a place neither of us had planned to visit, everything between us was about to change forever. One small conversation. Life rarely changes because of one perfect speech. More often, it changes because someone finally decides to stop defending themselves and starts listening instead. The morning after I read my son's unfinished letter, I made myself one simple promise. I would not prepare clever answers. I would not rehearse emotional speeches. I would simply be present. As I drove to work through the quiet streets of our American neighborhood, colorful autumn leaves drifted across the road, reminding me that even the strongest trees let go of old things before they can grow again. Maybe families had to do the same. Maybe I had to let go of my constant need to fix every problem before I could truly reconnect with my son. That afternoon, I finished work earlier than usual. Instead of driving straight home, I stopped at the small community park where our family had spent countless weekends when the children were younger. It was peaceful. Parents pushed toddlers on swings while runners followed the walking trail around a small lake. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh grass. I wasn't expecting anything special. I simply wanted to think. As I slowly walked toward a wooden bench overlooking the water, I suddenly recognized a familiar blue hoodie. My son was sitting alone, headphones resting around his neck, quietly throwing tiny pebbles into the lake. For a brief moment, I considered turning around. Maybe he wanted to be alone. Then he looked up, noticed me, and gave a small nod. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't rejection either. I walked over slowly and sat on the opposite end of the bench, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel trapped. For almost 2 full minutes, neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence no longer felt frightening. It simply felt honest. Finally, I smiled gently and looked across the lake instead of directly at him. "You know," I said softly, "when I first moved to America, I used to come to parks like this because I didn't understand enough English to join conversations. Watching ducks was easier than speaking." My son gave a quiet laugh. "Seriously?" "Very seriously," I answered. The ducks never corrected my grammar. This time he laughed a little louder. It wasn't forced. It simply happened. Communication researchers often explain that humor lowers emotional defenses and allows people to feel emotionally safer during difficult conversations. Sitting beside my son, I finally understood why laughter had once come so naturally between us. After another quiet moment, I took a slow breath. I read your letter, I admitted gently. He looked surprised but not angry. Before he could respond, I continued.
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to invade your privacy. It wasn't sealed, and I made a mistake. But I'm grateful I read it because it helped me understand something important about myself. He remained silent. This time, I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I simply waited. Nearly 30 seconds passed before he spoke. I wasn't sure if I wanted to give it to you. I know, I answered. And that's okay. He stared across the lake before quietly saying, I never wanted to stop talking to you. Those words broke something open inside my heart. Then why did it happen? I asked, keeping my voice calm. He picked up another small stone and gently tossed it into the water. Because every time I tried to tell you something, I felt like I was disappointing you before I even finished talking. I felt tears gathering in my eyes, but I didn't interrupt. Sometimes I wasn't looking for advice, he continued. Sometimes I just wanted my mom. Those 7 words carried more truth than any parenting book I had ever read. Clinical psychologists often describe active listening as one of the strongest ways to strengthen trust because it communicates acceptance before offering solutions. For years, I had believed helping meant answering. Now I realized helping sometimes meant remaining quiet long enough for someone else's heart to finally appear. I turned toward him for the first time.
I'm sorry, he whispered.
I thought I was protecting your future. I didn't realize I was making you feel alone. He nodded slowly. I know you were trying to help. We both smiled through tears. There was no dramatic music. No perfect movie ending. Just 2 ordinary people sitting on an old park bench learning how to become a family again. Before we left, my son surprised me with one simple request. Can we start taking walks like this once a week? I smiled immediately. I'd love that. And he added with a shy grin, can we practice English together again? Like when I was little.
No homework.
Just funny conversations. I laughed.
Deal.
As we stood up to walk back toward the parking lot together, I noticed something tucked beneath the bench where my son had been sitting. It was a folded flyer for the school's annual family story night. Across the top, in large letters, was this year's theme. The one conversation that changed everything. My son picked it up, looked at me, and quietly smiled. Neither of us realized that agreeing to attend that event together would soon lead to a moment our entire family would remember for the rest of our
lives.
Learning to listen again. Changing a family doesn't usually begin with a grand promise. It begins with one ordinary day when someone quietly decides to do one small thing differently. After our conversation at the park, life didn't suddenly become perfect. My son didn't wake up the next morning talking nonstop, and I didn't magically become the world's greatest parent overnight. Real healing almost never happens that way. Instead, it arrived in tiny moments that most people would probably overlook. On Monday morning, breakfast looked almost identical to every other day. The same wooden table, the same warm coffee, the same autumn sunlight shining through the kitchen window. But one simple habit changed everything. Instead of asking, "Did you finish your homework?" I smiled and said, "Tell me one interesting thing you noticed yesterday." My son looked surprised for a second. Then he thought carefully before answering. A squirrel stole another squirrel's acorn, and they chased each other across the schoolyard. I laughed. That sounds like a tiny action movie. He smiled. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was real. Neuroscientists explain that positive emotional interactions release chemicals in the brain associated with trust, safety, and connection. Small moments of shared laughter may seem insignificant, but repeated over time, they gradually rebuild emotional security. Looking back, I realized our family had spent months talking about responsibilities while forgetting to create simple moments worth remembering. That evening, after dinner, I suggested something that surprised everyone. How about 10 minutes of slow English before dessert? My husband smiled immediately because he remembered how much fun we used to have practicing together years earlier. My son hesitated for a moment before nodding. We gathered around the living room instead of sitting separately with our phones. There were no grammar books, no vocabulary tests, no pressure. I simply picked up a small notebook and began with an easy sentence. Today was a beautiful day. My husband continued. The weather was cool and sunny. My daughter laughed and added, I almost dropped my lunch at school. Finally, everyone looked at my son. He smiled shyly before saying, a squirrel became the fastest thief in America. The entire room burst into laughter. That tiny conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, but something remarkable happened. Nobody corrected anyone's pronunciation. Nobody interrupted. Nobody hurried to finish another person's sentence. We simply listened. Educational researchers have found that language learning becomes significantly more effective when learners feel relaxed and emotionally supported. Stress narrows attention, while enjoyment improves memory and confidence. Without realizing it, our family wasn't just rebuilding relationships. We were also rediscovering why learning together had once felt so natural. During the following weeks, our evening conversations slowly became a new family tradition. Sometimes we talked about funny memories from our first years in America. Sometimes we described our day using simple English sentences. Other evenings we told imaginary stories just to make each other laugh. One night my husband pretended our dog secretly worked for the FBI. Another evening my daughter invented a story about a talking pumpkin that wanted to become a famous singer. Even my son started creating ridiculous adventures involving squirrels, astronauts, and pizza restaurants on the moon. They weren't perfect English stories. They didn't need to be. They were ours. One Saturday afternoon we visited a local farmer's market, something we hadn't done together in a very long time. As we walked between colorful fruit stands and fresh flowers, my son quietly pointed toward an elderly couple holding hands while choosing apples. I hope I still laugh with my family when I'm their age, he said softly. His words caught me completely by surprise. I looked at him and smiled. I think you will. He looked back at me and replied, only if we keep talking. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. Family therapists often describe communication as emotional maintenance, much like watering a garden. Ignore it for too long, and even healthy relationships begin to dry out. Give it consistent care, however, and growth quietly returns. Weeks earlier, I had feared that silence would become permanent. Now I understood that trust wasn't rebuilt through one emotional conversation. It grew through hundreds of ordinary moments when people chose connection over correction. One evening, while organizing old family photo albums, my daughter discovered a picture from years ago. It showed all of us sitting on the living room floor surrounded by English flashcards, laughing because I had accidentally pronounced beach completely wrong. My son picked up the photograph and smiled. That was one of my favorite days, he admitted. I laughed too. Mine too. Then he surprised everyone by standing up, walking into his room, and returning with a small blue notebook that once terrified me. He placed it gently on the coffee table. I don't need this anymore, he said quietly. I looked at the cover that still read, Things I Can't Say. Before I could respond, he smiled and added, Now I think I can say them. My heart filled with hope, but I had no idea that only a few days later, during the school's family story night, my son would stand in front of an audience, take a deep breath, and say something that would leave our entire family and everyone in the room in complete silence. The day he finally smiled, Sometimes the moment you have been praying for doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrives with one simple smile that quietly tells you hope has found its way back home. A few days after my son placed the blue notebook on our coffee table and told me he no longer needed it, our family attended the school's annual family story night. The event was one of the most popular traditions in our small American community. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and students filled the school auditorium carrying homemade cookies, warm coffee, and nervous excitement. The stage was decorated with autumn leaves, paper lanterns, and a large banner that read, "The one conversation that changed everything." As we found our seats, I noticed my son holding a folded sheet of paper. "Are you speaking tonight?" I whispered. He shrugged with a nervous smile. "Maybe." My heart beat a little faster, but I didn't ask another question. I had finally learned that trust grows best when curiosity doesn't become pressure. The evening began with funny family stories, childhood memories, and heartwarming moments that filled the room with laughter. One father told everyone about accidentally sending his boss a grocery list instead of an important email. A little girl proudly described teaching her grandfather how to use emojis. Every story reminded me that families are rarely perfect. They are simply collections of people learning together. Then Mrs. Parker stepped onto the stage. "Our next volunteer," she announced warmly, "would like to share a story about listening." I looked toward the aisle and saw my son quietly standing up. Time seemed to slow. He walked confidently toward the microphone while our family watched in complete silence. For a brief second, he looked nervous. Then he smiled. It wasn't the uncertain smile I had seen over the past few weeks. It was calm, genuine, and full of quiet courage. "Good evening," he began in clear, simple English. "My name is Ethan, and a few weeks ago I stopped talking to someone I love very much." The room became completely still. He continued, "It wasn't because I hated my mom. It wasn't because I wanted to hurt her. I stopped talking because I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. I felt tears beginning to form, but I kept listening." "Sometimes people think silence means anger," he said. "Sometimes silence means someone is waiting to feel safe." Those words gently settled over the audience. People speak most openly when they believe they will be heard before they are judged. Listening to my son describe that truth in his own words made me realize how much he had grown. He smiled toward me before continuing. "My mom always wanted to help me. She wanted me to succeed. She wanted me to become a good person. But somewhere along the way, we both forgot something important. Before people need advice, they usually need understanding." I could see several parents quietly wiping away tears. Even Mrs. Parker lowered her eyes for a moment. Then my son laughed softly. "Last week my mom told me a funny story about confusing baking powder with washing powder when she first moved to America." The audience laughed together. That was the first conversation we had in a long time where nobody was trying to fix anyone. The laughter filled the room with warmth instead of sadness. Researchers studying positive psychology have found that shared laughter strengthens emotional bonds because it reduces stress hormones while increasing feelings of connection and belonging. Looking around the auditorium, I understood exactly what those studies meant. My son looked directly at me one final time before reading the last sentence from his paper. "Today I don't remember every piece of advice my mom ever gave me. But I will always remember the day she finally sat beside me and listened." The audience applauded, but I barely heard them. My eyes were fixed on my son as he walked back toward our family. Before he even reached his seat, I stood up and hugged him tightly. Neither of us said anything for several seconds because words suddenly felt too small for everything we were feeling. On the drive home beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, nobody turned on the radio. We simply talked. about school, about childhood memories, about dreams, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. When we stopped at a red light, my son looked out the window and quietly smiled again. "You know," he said, "I think this is the happiest car ride we've had in years." I smiled back. I was just thinking the same thing. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a small package resting on our front porch with no return address. Attached to it was a handwritten note containing only one sentence. "Every family has another chapter waiting to be written." None of us knew who had left it there. But opening that unexpected package the following morning would reveal a surprise that would change not only our family, but the way we looked at love, forgiveness, and the future forever. Becoming a stronger family. The greatest miracles rarely happen because life suddenly becomes easier. They happen because people choose each other again, even after disappointment, misunderstandings, and silence have tried to pull them apart. The morning after family story night, our family gathered around the kitchen table with the mysterious package we had found on the front porch. Sunlight filled the room, fresh pancakes were cooling on the table, and for the first time in what felt like forever, nobody seemed rushed. My son carefully untied the ribbon while my daughter leaned forward with excitement. Inside the box was an old-fashioned glass jar filled with dozens of small folded pieces of colorful paper. Resting on top was a handwritten card that simply read, "Family Conversation Jar. Open one question every day." There was no signature.
No explanation.
Only that simple invitation. My husband smiled. Maybe someone from school left this. My son shrugged. Whoever it was. I think they knew exactly what we needed. We unfolded the very first paper together. It asked, "What is one memory that always makes you smile?" Such an ordinary question. Yet instead of checking our phones or rushing through breakfast, everyone began sharing stories. My daughter laughed while remembering the day our dog chased wild geese around a lake. My husband admitted he still smiled whenever he thought about accidentally wearing 2 different shoes to work years ago. When it was my turn, I looked at my son and answered honestly. The happiest memory I have today happened only a few nights ago. When you stood on that stage and trusted me with your heart again. He smiled quietly without looking away. Researchers who study family resilience often explain that strong families are not those without conflict. They're families that intentionally create positive emotional experiences after conflict. Those moments become new memories that slowly replace painful ones. Looking around our breakfast table, I realized we weren't pretending the difficult weeks had never happened. We were simply refusing to let them become the entire story. As autumn slowly gave way to early winter, our new routines continued growing stronger. Every Sunday afternoon we took a long walk through the nearby park, regardless of the weather. Sometimes we practiced easy English together by describing the trees, the clouds, or the people walking their dogs. Other times we simply enjoyed the silence without feeling uncomfortable. Silence had changed its meaning. It was no longer a wall between us. It had become peaceful company. One Saturday, while we were decorating the house for the upcoming holidays, my son climbed into the attic searching for old Christmas decorations. A few minutes later, he called downstairs, "Mom, I found something." He carefully carried down a dusty cardboard box labeled Family Memories. Inside were hundreds of photographs, homemade Christmas cards, children's drawings, and tiny souvenirs from vacations across the United States. We spent hours sitting on the living room floor laughing at old hairstyles, funny family outfits, and childhood artwork that somehow looked even more creative years later. Then my son discovered a small notebook tucked beneath the photographs. It was my old English practice journal from when I had first arrived in America. He opened it carefully and smiled while reading one sentence aloud. Perfect English is not the goal. Real connection is. He looked at me with gentle surprise. You wrote this years ago? I nodded. I guess I forgot my own lesson. He closed the notebook and handed it back to me. I think we both remembered it just in time. Psychologists often describe forgiveness as a process rather than a single decision. Trust returns gradually through repeated experiences of honesty, consistency, and emotional safety. I could finally see that process unfolding inside our home. We weren't becoming a perfect family. We were becoming a real one. During the following week, something happened that quietly confirmed how much had changed. While driving my son to school, he suddenly turned down the music and said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" Months earlier, I would have answered immediately. This time, I simply smiled. Of course. He hesitated before speaking. If I ever stop talking again, will you remind me about this year instead of getting angry? I reached over and gently squeezed his hand at the next red light. I promise, I said softly. And if I ever stop listening again, you have permission to remind me too.
He laughed. Deal.
It was the kind of agreement no lawyer could ever write, yet it carried more meaning than any contract. As we arrived at school, he picked up his backpack, opened the car door, then suddenly leaned back inside. Love you, Mom. Love you too, I answered without hesitation. After he walked toward the school entrance, I remained parked for another minute, smiling through grateful tears. I believed our hardest chapter was finally behind us. But that evening, while checking the mailbox after dinner, I found one final envelope addressed to our entire family. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were the words, "Please open this together on Christmas Eve." None of us knew what was inside, yet somehow we all sensed that the final page of our family's story had not been written yet. The words I will never forget. Christmas Eve arrived more quietly than any holiday I could remember. Snow covered the rooftops of our neighborhood. Warm lights glowed through every window, and the smell of cinnamon, cookies, and fresh pine filled our home. Months earlier, I had believed our family was falling apart one silent breakfast at a time. Now we were gathered around the fireplace, wrapped in soft blankets, sipping hot chocolate, laughing over stories that had nothing to do with homework, responsibilities, or problems waiting to be solved. Yet one mystery remained. The envelope sitting beneath our Christmas tree. The one that simply said, "Please open this together on Christmas Eve." My husband carefully picked it up and placed it in the center of the coffee table. We looked at each other before my son smiled and said, "I think it's time." He slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. There was no name at the top, only one sentence written in careful handwriting. This letter belongs to every family that has ever forgotten how to listen. The room became completely silent. My son began reading aloud. Families do not become stronger because they avoid difficult days. They become stronger because someone chooses to stay, chooses to forgive, and chooses to listen one more time than they feel like listening. Nobody interrupted. Even the crackling fireplace seemed quieter. The letter continued, "Children do not need perfect parents. Parents do not need perfect children. What both need is the courage to begin another conversation." I felt tears slowly filling my eyes. Those words somehow captured everything we had lived through during the past few months. Positive psychology researchers often explain that lasting happiness is built less through extraordinary achievements and more through meaningful relationships, gratitude, and emotional connection. Sitting there beside my family, I realized success suddenly looked very different from the picture I once carried inside my head. Success was not perfect grades. It was not flawless parenting. It was hearing my son laugh freely again. It was sharing ordinary evenings without emotional distance. It was knowing our home had become a safe place instead of a stressful one. My son reached into the envelope again and discovered something unexpected. It wasn't another letter. It was a blank sheet of paper. Across the bottom, someone had written, "Write the next chapter together." We all looked at one another and smiled. My daughter grabbed a pen first. She wrote, "I want our family to keep laughing." My husband added, "I promise to make more time for simple conversations." Then the paper reached me. I paused for several seconds before writing only one sentence. "I promise to listen before I try to fix." Finally, my son accepted the pen. He looked down thoughtfully before smiling. "I think this is easy," he said. In careful handwriting, he wrote, "I promise to keep talking, even when it's hard." There it was. The sentence I had hoped for since that unforgettable silent breakfast. Not because every problem had disappeared. Not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because we had finally learned that honest conversations are not signs of weakness. They are signs of trust. We placed the paper back inside the envelope and tucked it into our family memories box, where it would remain beside old photographs, Christmas cards, and every reminder that love sometimes grows strongest after it has been tested. Later that evening, we stepped outside together as gentle snowflakes drifted through the cold winter air. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath thousands of colorful Christmas lights. My son stood beside me looking toward the quiet street before softly asking, "Mom, do you remember the morning I stopped talking?" I nodded. "I'll never forget it." He smiled warmly. "Me neither. But now I think it was the beginning, not the ending." His words settled deep inside my heart. Looking back, I realized that silence had not destroyed our family. It had revealed what needed to change. Every difficult conversation, every tear, every mistake, every patient moment of listening had quietly led us to this peaceful Christmas night. Sometimes the greatest gift is not wrapped beneath a tree. Sometimes it is the courage to hear someone you love with your whole heart. And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can carry into every new year, every new relationship, and every new conversation. If this story reminded you of someone you love, perhaps today is the perfect day to start one small conversation that could change everything. Because the strongest families are not the ones that never struggle. They are the ones that never stop choosing each other.